Welcome everyone. For those that have come a bit early, the webinar doesn't start until 5 past, so we're just going to sort of hold off a little bit. For those who are here right now, I thought I'd quickly share two sets of resources. This is one for sort of on the measurement of aspirations, which is the topic of this talk. There's a paper by Tanguy Bernard and Ale Mayehu, who wrote a paper in the Journal of African Economies called Aspirations, an approach to measurement with validation using Ethiopian data, which is a great resource that's incredibly relevant to this topic. And as part of the Mind and Behavior Research Group, we have some additional resources on this. The first thing, of course, is we have these Measures Matter posts on the link that's just shared. That's contains a lot of sort of posts on how to sort of apply behavioral measures in the field using experience from some of our researchers. And we also have various instruments and materials that we've put up. This is a relatively new addition to our website, but it includes all the qualitative and quantitative instruments used. So this will include questionnaires, training manuals, and other intervention materials. Currently, we only have one entry up on the cash and aspirational video trial in Kenya. And please feel free to have a look at those instruments if you're sort of interested in how to implement sort of this type of intervention in a future project. So this is the fourth of a set of measurement webinars hosted by the Mind and Behavior Research Group at the Center for the Study of African Economies at the University of Oxford. This webinar is on the measurement of aspirations. So before I describe what sort of the format of this, I'd like to introduce Tanguy Bernard, who is a professor of economics at the University of Bordeaux in France and a non-resident senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute. His research essentially focuses on rural development issues, mainly in Africa, south of the Sahara. He'll be our main speaker today. We also have on the panel Dr. Kate Orkin, who's a senior research fellow in behavioral economics at the Blavatnik School of Government here at the University of Oxford. And she also leads the Mind and Behavior Research Group alongside Professor Stefan Durkin. She'll shortly have a couple minutes. But before we sort of hand over to the speakers, I just wanted to give a quick overview for how the webinar will proceed. So after this, Professor Tanguy will present for approximately 15 minutes. During this time, you may ask clarifying questions using the Q&A function. And the idea is that when you ask these questions, we will select some of the questions and then ask the audience member to actually ask the question out loud. So we will unmute you. So if any of the audience members does not have any audio equipment in the question, if you could please maybe include that you don't have any mic or something along those lines, so we won't sort of call on you and slow the speed, but we might still ask your question. In that case, I would ask the question. During this question and answer session, we'll have approximately around 40 minutes. And please just keep asking questions away in the Q&A section. There's no chat function, so it's sort of a one-way question and answer session. On that note, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Kate Orkin for a couple minutes.
So I'll be very quick. I just wanted to say a personal thanks to Tanguy for, so we had a speaker withdrawal from another person who's also worked a lot on this concept. And so Tanguy stepped in very quickly to do this, which we're really grateful for. So thank you very much to him. And then thank you also to the CSA team who've organized all of the last, the last three and today's workshops. So Samir and the CMCA communications team, also Steph on our team, and then thanks very much to all of the moderators. We've had amazing attendance from around the world for the last couple of seminars, and really lovely feedback from all of you who seem to have found this very useful. So we hope that you will enjoy today's session, go back and look at the recordings on our website for the previous sessions if you haven't seen them already, and that you please also tell friends and colleagues about these resources. We really want them to be used. But thanks again to Tanguy, and I'll now hand over to him and Paul for the webinar.
Thank you very much, Kate. Tanguy, shall you go ahead?
Hi, everyone. So should I share my screen now? Is that correct, Paul?
Yes, please. And you'll have around 15 minutes.
There we go. Can you see it properly?
I can, yes.
There we go. Okay. Well, thanks, thanks, Paul. Thanks, Kate. Thanks the whole CSA team for inviting me. It's always very useful for us to give these presentations and to think back a little bit on what we've been doing. I also very much appreciate, I think, Paul, you said that we'll see who's attending from where at some point. It's one of the very few positive outcomes of this sanitary crisis we're going through, is the fact that we are reinventing ourselves and we're able to come up with these kind of venues where we reach out to a much wider audience. So thanks again for inviting me. So I'm not going to be very, very long. I've titled this talk Aspirations, a Research Journey in Ethiopia. It's a journey because it started I'm a bit ashamed to say it, but it's almost 10 years ago. And it started with my longtime co-author, Alemayo Seyum Tafese, with whom we've written the paper that Paul was referring to. But I should say that very quickly, we had the opportunity to work with Stefan and Kate, that you all know from the University of Oxford, in a larger research project we're still working on. And then there was also much research assistance, way too many to cite. So it's a research journey. How did it start? It started with a question on why is it that poor people do not engage in actions that can better their future? And why do they do it despite the fact that very often they do have access to information, and oftentimes they also have means to seize opportunities. These opportunities could relate to children education, to agricultural technologies, to preventive health measures, etc. And so when we started this work in 2005, so again, sorry for the younger audience, but 2005, I was living in Ethiopia together with my colleague Alemayo, and doing field work, talking to NGO experts, NGO agents, government agents, number of community leaders. Everyone, when we were asking these questions, people were telling us, well, it's just because, poor people are fatalistic, meaning that they don't seize those opportunities just because they're fatalistic. And so as an economist, we found it quite difficult to grasp what exactly does it mean to be a fatalistic. At the same time, in economics, there was, for a long time, but the state of the art at the time was that economists had documented a number of reasons why poor may not access a number or seize a number of opportunities, because of market failure, risk markets, credit market, land markets, a number of externalities that were not accounted for, etc. But also norms and power structures, issues of gender, of castes, etc. Some issues more behavioral that relate to mental processes, issues of impatience, discounting, commitment failure, etc., etc. Around the same time, in early 2000s, there was actually a World Bank symposium on sort of community action, and in this symposium, two authors really were of great interest for us. One was Aruna Padurai, who's an anthropologist, and Deborah Zray, that you may all know of, which is a professor at NYU. And so, according to them, the poor, because this is really the question we have is, why is it that the poor themselves do not invest in those opportunities? So what aspects of poverty make you unable to grasp these opportunities, aside from issues of say, monetary capacity? And so according to them, the poor face particular constraints in their capacity to aspire to a better future. And they related that in part to the fact that the way one form his aspiration depends on what they call the aspiration window, which is the type of people you can observe around you, the kind of experiences that they've had, and the sort of the information that you get from your vicinities, and that helps you think about what you could be in the future. And so, according to these authors, there were some reasons that could explain why poor, because they are poor, have difficulties to aspire to a better future and therefore to grasp those available opportunities. So this is the why we get interested in this concept. Again, we didn't invent it. but we found that at the time it was one that would better fit or we're more interested in trying to explain what we were seeing. So now the what. So what is it, once we've said that, what is it that we call aspirations? So a dictionary definition is fairly clear. It's a desire or an ambition to achieve something. I see Kate laughing because we've been talking a lot about this. Importantly, there are several components that are embedded in these concepts. First of all, they are future-oriented. They are not about immediate gratification. For instance, let's say that I am hungry and I want to become non-hungry right away. We don't call this an aspiration, it's just about satisfying immediate need, which is very different from the goal to be food secure in the future, which we can better refer as related to aspirations. So they are future-oriented, not about immediate gratification. Aspirations are motivators. They are goals that individuals are willing to invest time, efforts, and eventually money to achieve. So they're motivators. They do motivate you into taking certain actions that may enable you to reach those goals. Quite often, aspirations are multidimensional. They are sort of life outcome, but they can also translate into dimension-specific goals. I could aspire to have a given level of income, given level of assets, my kids to reach a given level of education. So these are sort of components of aspirations, but we could also think about aspirations as he aspires, he has high aspirations for him or his children, etc., which is more probably a combination of these dimensions. So the first time we started thinking about this, at some point I had written a first paper with my co-authors, and I had the opportunity to present it at the Royal Economic Society. And fortunately or unfortunately, my reviewer was Charles Mansky. And so Charles Mansky is one of my heroes, in particular in the way we can econometrically address issues of non-market exchanges. And so his point, his critique to our paper was, listen, we have many concepts in economics. Why do you want to create a new one? In economics, we have expectations, we have preferences, and we have constraints. And that's all we need, unless you can convince me otherwise. I don't think I did convince him that day, but it's gotten us to think a lot about it. And so what are expectations? Expectations are likelihood of possible states and action outcome links. What are preferences? They are desirableness of various states. I can hope to become very famous. I can hope to, I can wish to become very wealthy, etc. These are my preferences. And then we have constraints, which are essentially the choice sets that are available for action. So is there a new concept that is not captured by the first three? I don't think so. But aspirations, the way we see it, is somewhat of a combination of all of these. They can be defined as bounds among individual preferences. And these bounds are related to expectations. You know, what's the probability distribution of various states in the future. They're related to my constraints. I can hope to become Brad Pitt tomorrow, but I do have some initial constraints to reach that goal. And very importantly, they're related to my preferences, which is among all those possible outcomes, which are the ones that I want to project myself into. So aspirations related to economics is not a new concept. It's probably a combination, one point of combination of these concepts of expectation, preferences, and constraints. So then we went on to say to try and measure it. If we want to test some theory, and in particular some theory that related to those developed by Aruna Padurai and Behavioural, we needed some instruments, and this is where we come to the core of this talk. We needed we seek to develop a survey instrument, and we wanted this survey instrument to be reliable, that is systematic, replicable, consistent. In that if I was to ask one of you today, what is your aspiration according to these various dimensions, and if I was to come again tomorrow, would I find the same kind of answer? Are these reliable? to what extent are these answers affected by the way I ask this question or the questions before it. And I'll come back to this. We wanted this survey instrument, to be valid. Valid in the sense that it would help us quantify or classify individuals along a dimension that does characterize their aspiration level, and that is in fact aspiration and not some other concepts. We wanted it to be also usable. It's great to define a super sophisticated measurement instrument, but it needs to be usable. At some point, you need to do a survey, so you need to have enumerators, especially if you want to do a large survey. And this instrument needs to be sufficiently simple for everyone to use and for all the respondents to understand. Importantly, at the time, there was no pre-registration of randomized control trials, for instance, in economics. And so the reason why we wrote this paper was also to sort of tie our hands. Not only did we want to measure, to come up with a measurement strategy, we also wanted to publish this paper before we engage into a larger randomized control trial where this measure would be the key outcome. And it was a way for us to say we move away from data mining and from all sorts of other issues. We really we stick our head out and we say, this is the measure we want to use, and we want to use it because we see that it works. I mean, at least that's what we were about to test. And if it worked, then this is going to be the outcome of the next randomized control trial. So this was our goal: reliable, valid, usable, and again, published before we were engaging into this larger RCT. There were many issues, especially with self-reported measures, and I think you all are experts of this probably more than I am. These issues relate to, first, subject-specific constraints. Will the respondents be willing to report private knowledge? Do they have evaluation apprehension? Can they play a role? If I ask you today, how much income do you want to make tomorrow? Are you going to give me something that is credible, or are you going to tell me that you want to make 10 million euros or pounds every month? How do we get the kind of answer that actually makes sense? So there are some subject-specific issues. There are also some issues that relate to the instrument itself. We all know that the questions you ask before this kind of attitudinal questions, the question that you ask just before may create some sort of anchoring issues. We know that the number of categories on a rating scale may affect the way people respond to this scale. What kind of adjectives should we use? What are the scale's endpoints that we should use, etc. And so these subject-specific and these instrument-specific issues in self-reported measure can create noise. And it's, in a way, it's never okay, but the best option would be that this noise would be random. In this case, you get a classical measurement error. If you were to use aspirations as an independent variable, you may create some attenuation bias, even less bias if you were to use it as a dependent variable. So random noise would sort of be okay. At worst, you would be under-reporting an effect. And I think it's better to be under-reporting than over-reporting. But the problem is more important if these biases are systematic. For instance, will the biases that come with the reported level of aspiration be correlated with the true level of aspiration? And if you have that kind of issue, then you will get all sorts of biases in unknown directions and whatever estimation form you use. So these are the issues. So how do we go about it? First of all, we defined scales. So we work with 4 different constituents: income, wealth, social recognition, and children's education. And for each of these, we ask a number of aspirational questions. We wanted to avoid the fact that individuals may report their wishes and focus on the subset of preferences that are actually relevant to the behavior regarding the future. And so here we went back to Mansky, who worked on expectations before, and he recommended and he tested the fact that first, if you ask about minimum and maximum possible outcomes, it helps people think better about their answers when it comes to their own aspirations, and therefore you get a more credible answer. Because you add those questions before you ask these aspirations questions, you may also potentially reduce anchoring effects of questions that came even before that. So we did ask about actual minimum and maximum for persons of a reported level of income, for instance, for persons in the individual's neighborhood. And for that, we use visual scales. Of course, the respondents can, later on, when they talk about their own aspirations report higher than local maximum for their own aspirations, but still it gave them some sort of a canvas or prior on which to base their answer. And then we also ask about current levels. So overall, we came to each respondent, and for each of these dimensions, we first started to say, what is the minimum level of income that one typically can get in this community? What is the maximum level of income that one can typically get in this community? What is your current level of income? And then we said, what is the income that you wish to attain in the future, given all this information? And again, people could respond a level of income that was past the maximum, but at least they had reported on the maximum before that. So we did this for income, for assets, for children's education, and for social recognition. Then we thought about how do we aggregate these constituents? We could have asked one general question about what is your general level of aspiration for the future. But we thought this could be a potential loss of information because, you know, we don't all think about the different dimensions of our life in the same way. So we decided to come up with different constituents, but for each of them, we used the exact same questioning. And then we designed an individual specific weighting scheme to account for the fact that Kate may give a high preference on children's education. I may be more interested in income, for instance, etc. So each one of us values different aspects of our future life differently. So we ask each of the respondents to take 20 beans, I think. It was 20 beans, and then to create piles of beans according to the dimensions that were more important to them. So you could put 5 beans for each of these dimensions, or 10 for one, 0 for another one, 5, 5, etc., etc. And so we thought about using this to weight the different components of aspirations into a general component. Lastly, because income is different than years of education, we transformed all of these values into standardized measures by removing the mean and the value by the standard deviation. So we had the same unit for all of them. So what are the results of this? So we did a pilot test. First of all, which is the paper that Paul was referring to, which were 2 rounds of data collection, a couple of weeks apart in 2 villages. And so it's just a pilot. So we only had 44 observations, but each of them we visited twice. So we tested for the reliability of our instruments. First of all, do we find that if you ask the same question to an individual 2 or 3 weeks apart, do you find the same level of answer? And we do find very high correlation between what people had said a few weeks before and what they said now. Do these measures of aspiration depend on one's mood? And so before that, before we asked those questions, we said, so how are you today on a scale of from 1 to 10? And so we try and relate this statistically to the level of aspiration that people report, and we didn't find any effect. Then we tested for anchoring effects. And in particular, we had a series of questions asking about other members of the community's aspiration. And so for half of the respondents, we asked this question before asking them about their own aspiration. And for the other half, we asked about it later. And this was all randomly chosen, and we don't find any effect of anchoring effect there. And then, does this all depend on the framing, on the type of word that we use, etc.? We tested using a different measure, which was just Likert scale questions that we did not prefer because we thought there was less information in there. But what we find is that at least these two did correlate very significantly. So we think we are sort of okay in terms of reliability. In terms of validity, are we sure that we're really measuring aspiration? For instance, is it the case that when we ask about to what extent do you want your children to go far in his education? Is it because one has better information we get this answer, or is it really because of aspiration? So for half of the respondents, randomly, we gave them on the first round information about returns to education in Ethiopia, saying, well, if your kid goes to school to this level, this is on average what can be expected on the labor markets. So is it the case that those who got that information in the first round, do they answer the aspiration question that relate to education differently in the second round? We don't find any effect there. In terms of determinants, is it the case that our measure of aspiration relate to what we could expect in terms of individual characteristics? And what we find is that this measure does seem to respond to opportunities. For instance, we found that male have higher aspirations and that those that have higher educations have higher aspirations. And again, this is happening in about 15 years ago. No, yeah. In Ethiopia, in rural Ethiopia, where true that being a female, being a woman led to lesser opportunities, and same for education. We don't find any effect of age, and that's probably good news because we thought this was quite ambiguous. Still on validity, do we find that those that have reported higher aspirations, does that relate to some sort of behavior that we expect to be positively related to aspirations? And for that, we ask a number of questions, hypothetical questions about demand for credits. And what we found is that those that report having a higher level of aspiration ask for more money in terms of longer term loans. And importantly, they plan to use it more for future-oriented investments rather than immediate consumptions. So on the validity standpoint, we thought that this instrument was correlated well with what we expected in terms of determinants and in terms of likely behavior. Lastly, in terms of usability, we found that respondents were responding it quite easily, but there was an important point of intention is that we had two types of enumerators, some that we had worked with for a long time before and some that had never done surveys, essentially. And we randomly varied these enumerators across farmers and across rounds. And what we find is that we do find a systematic difference between more experienced enumerators and lower experienced enumerators. So this means that it is still it is a questionnaire that does function, but you do need to be very to put a lot of effort, at least in the training, when you want this to be implemented by enumerators. And last, and I'll finish with this, also in terms of validation of this, I think the most important point of validation is what people have done with it later on. And we were lucky enough that many other people have asked for these bits of questionnaire and attempted to use it in various locations. So we had such questionnaires used in Pakistan, in Ghana, in DRC. The Young Life Survey has mobilized it, various authors, Katrina Karsek, Bruce Riddick, and many others. And of course, the large-scale project in Kenya that is running at CSA. And so the feedback we get from it is that, yes, this did relate to these measures of aspirations, did relate to what was expected in terms of individuals' behavior. The question was usable, it was somewhat reliable and rather valid. So this is when this is used as when it is used for descriptive statistic purposes, or when it is used as an independent variable. Now, an important aspect is what happens if we want to use it as an outcome variable. And recall that this is what we had in mind originally. And this is what we've been implementing with Stefan Durkon and Kate Orkin, along with Alan Mayo and myself in Ethiopia. And so we had this intervention that was specifically designed at boosting people's aspiration. And the fact that we see, results in the shorter and in the longer run, that this intervention did help raise people's aspiration, is in itself a validation of the intervention, which does raise aspiration, but also of the measure, because we do see that something that is supposed to boost aspiration, we can actually see this in the data that measures aspiration. Importantly, in this work, we've been playing with much more data, much more observation, and therefore we are able to go a bit further in terms of investigating this measure. We don't find any systematic differences between framing this questionnaire as goals or aspirations, or as expectation. Typically, we find rather similar results with some minor differences. If you were to ask, what is it that you wish to attain, or what is it that you think you will attain, which we call expectations. We don't find any systematic differences between weighted and non-weighted aggregation. So remember that we had designed this way of helping people choose which part of their life was more important than another. We find that whether we use this weighted aggregation or whether we use the same weight for each of the dimension, we don't find any massively different results. And again, there are many other studies ongoing, in particular in Kenya. I think one of the major caveats that we have had with this work is that we don't really capture health dimension, and it has always been important. I think it's even more important in the current time. Reason why we didn't include it was that we felt at the time, at least, that it was very difficult to define what we meant by good health, etc. So, in other words, health is an outcome that is better defined negatively as not being sick rather than positive. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanguy. Do you mind if you stop sharing? So as questions come through, I thought I would possibly start first and just sort of maybe throw a question to Tanguy about sort of high values of aspirations. I know we sort of talk about having minimum and maximum values to sort of make sure you don't kind of have a position, but for certain values that are very unbounded, let's say something like income, how do you sort of try to distinguish between sort of an aspiration that can motivate you versus almost something that's just too big and is just sort of more of a wishful idea? So something like with education, you can have a maximum education level you think you can attain, but then there's also sort of a real world maximum there. And a real world sort of maximum income, it's hard to sort of impose. So my main question is, how would you deal with very large values of aspirations?
So I think there are two parts to this question. One is people can report overly high levels of aspirations, say for income, for education, and for others, etc., which is a bit of a measurement error. And the other thing is people can actually only think about getting a PhD, despite the fact that the probability for the children to reach secondary school is already less than one. I think so that's one of the reasons why we really wanted to not to bound the answers that people could give, but to give them at least some background that they could have in mind when they were answering these questions. And this is where the reason why we ask people first, what is the minimum and what is the maximum that people around you typically get to? Again, they could respond higher. The other part of the question relates to sort of what we do in terms of analysis. As an economist, and in particular as an empiricist, I don't expect to be able to grasp the true value for every individual, and we do essentially think at the mean. What you want is this mean to be unbiased. And so a lot of the work that we've been doing, and I think that needs to be done with this kind of measure in particular, is to really strongly test for the robustness of your results, whether you use the entire sample or whether you Winsorize or you crop a little bit. And because again, these extreme values could really push your mean upward, and you could give way too much weight to a particular individual response. So I would strongly suggest that when you use particularly this attitudinal data, and in particular those where you have to report on your dreams, basically, to really implement those robustness tests on the sample used.
Thank you, Tanguy. I think we actually have a few questions from other audience members. So I think we would like to unmute Martin Pohl, I believe is a doctoral researcher with the Institute for Food and Resource Economics at the University of Bonn. Can you please ask a question?
Perhaps just ask the question for him.
Okay. So Martin Pohl's question is, do you think there will be any differences if rather than asking what households want to achieve in the future, you asked what they need in the future? I feel want is really more open and general than sort of need. They may not internalize their efforts in want. I hope the question is clear, Tanguy.
Yeah, it is clear. The way, so we haven't, again, what you want is for people to think about their goals, basically. And their goals could be, I want to be food secure. That is just in terms of satisfying my basic needs. Other goals could be, I just want to read and write, etc. So in a way, I think looking at needs only would probably be on the lower, pushing the scale a bit lower down. It is somewhat of a different concept, obviously, but I think it would push things down a little bit. And also, I'm not sure we'll get so much in terms of variability. If you ask about people's needs, I would guess that needs are much more common across individuals than aspirations are. And I'm not sure that we drive all our efforts related to our needs. In a way, again, start with the initial question, which was, why is it that sometimes you find that there are opportunities? There is a school that is open, and it's not true that that there is no labor around, or that that there is such important demand for farm labor in the family, and yet the kids don't go to school. Why is it that people don't go there? So I think it goes beyond the need a little bit. Is what is it that makes people think that there is no reason for them to invest in this kind of behavior? And I would maybe suppose that, but I would need to think more about it, but maybe suppose that if it was just in terms of needs, one would get less variability.
Thank you. I think we'll move on to our next question from Patricio Dalton, who's an associate professor of economics at Tilburg University. Please ask your question.
Hello, and thank you very much, Tanguy, for this presentation. You know, I have used these your instrument in Indonesia, also in Ghana. It's really helpful. But you haven't talked about measurement of beliefs, so you know, self-efficacy or locus of control, and I think you do use them in Ethiopia as well. So I am asking this because you ask about the level of wish you attain. And that can be confounded hope with aspirations. So in Ghana, for example, we have rural cassava processors. When we ask about the aspirations, they have very high aspirations, but they are not really aspirations, because then when we ask, you know, whether it is their effort or God that is going to help them achieve their aspirations, is basically mostly is God. So basically what we manage to measure is more kind of a hope of a level, and rather than an actual aspiration that can motivate effort. So I wanted to ask you about, you didn't mention beliefs, but I think beliefs are quite important to distinguish between the two notions.
Yeah, I think this is extremely important. So I should say that, yeah, when I mentioned that this survey had been used in Ghana, it was effectively Patricio. And so yes, this is an important answer. So we do ask in our questionnaire, we also ask a number of other questions for two reasons. One is, so some other attitudinal question for two reasons. One is because we want to see where we would expect the story to be similar, we do find similarities, and where we would expect the story to be different, we would find dissimilarities. And by that, I mean that, for instance, in the work that I've been involved with Stefan and Kate and Alemayo, what we find is that our aspiration-oriented intervention, which were documentaries that were screened to rural households, we find that these documentaries affected aspirations, the way we measured it, did not affect, for instance, preference for presence. It did not affect risk-related attitude. So that's sort of the good news. We did not expect this to affect those other aspects of one's cognition, let's say. But yet they did also affect, and I think this is also what we expected. They did affect some other measures of, as you said, locus of control, self-efficacy, etc., which we think are necessarily related and positively related to aspirations. I would say aspiration is probably a good part of it in a way. Locus of control is whether or not you are capable of putting yourself at reaching a goal. So obviously, I think it's part of the same reasoning. So we do find positive correlation here, similarity of results, and yeah, it would be difficult. I do think that the aspiration components does go in some bit of a different direction. I think it's not exactly the same flavor, but they are definitely related. Kate, do feel free to intervene if you like, as you also have the results there.
No, I didn't have anything to add to that. That made a lot of sense.
Okay, thanks for that, Tanguy. So I think we'll be moving on next to a question from Ralicia, if I pronounced that correctly, who I believe is a DPhil student in clinical medicine at the University of Oxford.
Yes.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, yeah, thank you. My background is not in behavior science or something. I'm public health, and I was wondering, because this is really related to the intervention in public health. So, if any, is there any differences between your findings, which is in low-income country, and the poor community in the high-income country? Thank you.
Thanks, Alicia, for this question. I think it's an excellent one. It's probably something that that would be interesting to test. I think so. What some of us have started to be doing is to, on a sort of a bit of a different level, to compare what was happening in rural communities and also to try and measure aspirations in urban setting. Why I think it's interesting is because urban contexts have much more interactions. You are much more access to information as well, and so the aspiration window, the dynamics of aspiration that we're sort of studying, which is based on aspiration window. Well, the aspiration window is quite different. And I think this is something that is important to investigate. I haven't been involved in that. I wouldn't be able to comment right now on some of the results, but I think this is the first contrast that is important. Now, clearly, looking at more of a higher income country setting, I think it would be very interesting. There's been quite a number of studies on locus of control, on the life outcome, desires, etc., in a high-income country. But I think the link between what we've been doing and this still needs to be done. And yeah, I think this is probably a good thing to investigate. I'm talking to all students here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just to let everyone know, we have around 10 more minutes left. So if you do want to get any questions in, please get them in as soon as you can. I think the next question we're going to have is from James Walsh, who is a doctoral student here at the Blavatnik School of Government. James, please ask away.
Thanks, me and Bo. So also, I've been a fan of you guys' work for a very long time, and have really thought hard about aspirations as a result of kind of the stuff that you've been doing. And this is a great opportunity just like to ask some of the questions I've had for quite a while. So you described aspirations as a desire or an ambition to achieve something. And then you kind of reference Mansky's kind of concern about that approach. And I just kind of like to follow up on that about how you think about it, because from my perspective, I've always, when trying to understand the construct that you use as aspirations, always understood it really as a preference for some kind of future set of affairs. And of course, I think why what you're describing is kind of relevant is because if aspirations change, then it may change kind of people's future sense of themselves, and it can be understood in that regard as a kind of addressing a constraint of some sort. But I'm just wondering, kind of, to what degree do you think this fits in a kind of standard economic model where you've got your utility function, and can this be really understood just as preferences, or is it the case that this is something kind of distinct and incommensurate? And if it is the case that it's solving kind of some sort of constraint, could you just disaggregate kind of aspirations into kind of preferences, which are kind of some kind of desired set of affairs, and the other component parts, which are more descriptive, like self-efficacy or locus of control? So I'm just curious about how you're thinking about all that.
Yeah, I don't think there is, I think you said it right, is the way we think of this. I don't think we have established a final answer on this. I don't think we're there yet. Again, the idea is that I think it goes, even though what we find in our results is that the measures of expectation and aspirations and the impact of our intervention on it are quite similar. I still think that there is a bit of a difference. Typically, I can expect things to change in a certain way, but within these changes, I wish to obtain a particular outcome. So I think, as you said, I do think that there is a strong component of preferences of aspiration within a set of expectation and constraints. As you said, constraints are themselves endogenous. In a way, I could say, well, the set of constraints that I'm facing today, I may wish to address them in order to reach my goal later on. I don't think we've gone there yet, at least. I mean, the reason is that the way we've been pursuing this so far is is very much from an empirical perspective. We have thought about how to model it, but in a rather simple way. In a way, it's just basically your utility depends in part on the distance to what you wish to attain. But you're right, the distance can be revised as we move on. From a pure theory or like more of a theory perspective, there's been great work over at Warwick and at NYU, trying to express it more dynamically. How do people rethink about their aspirations along the way? Because this is the aspirations we have today, but as I move on with my life, and maybe as I improve my outcomes, maybe I'm going to revise my aspirations later on. I'm saying that because Paul had a question that he'd sent me before about our aspirations meant to be achieved. I don't think, in a way, yes and no. I think we constantly revise the way we see the future, and so I guess, shorter response to your question. I think what would be needed today to be able to answer this with data, because I think I don't want to be too speculative about it, would be to have longitudinal data. I mean, young lives is obviously one place to start, but there could be other cohorts to be studying. And I think looking at the dynamics of the aspiration, how people choose to work on their constraints, and how that affects their preferences, their expectations, etc. I think is something we can think of it, but I don't think we have the data to validate anything so far. Or maybe I'm not yet aware of it.
Great, thanks. Thank you.
I don't want to say anything too stupid, because I know we're recorded.
Thanks, James, for that. I think we have time for just one last question. So I thought I would sort of just end with a sort of maybe a very relevant question, Tanguy, given the current circumstances. And it's a bit about the measurement of aspirations in times of high levels of uncertainty, such as sort of with COVID right now. And it's sort of easy to understand that if you go and measure expectations right now, perhaps the standard deviation of their sort of expected outcomes in the future might be a bit all over the place, given the uncertainty we're in. What is your sort of, can you maybe comment a little bit about the role of uncertainty and aspirations? Do we expect aspirations to sort of fluctuate a lot, or are they meant to be a little more stable? You talk about food security as one of your examples, but I thought if you could maybe comment a bit on that interaction, and then maybe say a few sort of closing words before we wrap up the webinar.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, when we think about uncertainty, the first thing that would come to my mind is that we're facing the most non-idiosyncratic shock ever. We are like world covariate shock, which is, when we think about uncertainty, the way we model it regularly is people thinking about individually, idiosyncratically, how do we think about it? But I think, I don't think we've apprehended what happens when the whole world changes right away. I have seen some maps, dynamic maps, where you see that at some point in April last year, there was not a single kid in school in the world. I don't think we've ever seen that. So clearly, this is a major collective shock. Does it affect preferences? I would expect, I mean, I would think that it should not affect the way people wish to live their life. Does it affect constraints and expectations? Does it affect constraints in the short run? For sure. Does it affect expectations? Yeah, clearly there is huge standard deviation around what we can think of the future. So how does that affect aspiration as a whole? I don't know. My gut feeling is that people, it's difficult to think long-term these days. And that's, and yeah, it would be difficult to do a survey on aspirations today. I don't know, maybe some of you have some surveys out these days, and it'd be interesting to see whether you've started running it before, after lockdown, etc. Yeah, I don't have a clear answer to that. Sorry.
No, thank you. I don't think it's a difficult question to answer, which is why I saved it for last. But I guess, yeah, did you just have maybe one quick minute to sort of, any sort of concluding comments, sort of looking forward about measuring aspirations, just to sort of end this webinar?
No, first of all, thanks again for these interactions, and for all these very important questions that I haven't been working very lately on aspirations, so I think it's a good kick in the butt to get back to it, actually, all these good questions. As I said, this is a journey. I really don't think we've reached the end of this story. I'm very glad that the work that Alemario, Stefan, Kate, and I have been doing has triggered others to also be interested. I mean, obviously, Devergerie and Aspirations contributed most to it, but I'm happy that we're building a bit of a community around these issues. And I think, yeah, much more is to come in the future. I'm really looking forward to see some of the results from these surveys that are out there these days. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you. And just on one last note, I just wanted to briefly just share our website at the Mind Behaviour Research Group. This is where the Measures Matter posts are. That's where the instruments are also on this website that I showed at the presentation at the beginning of the webinar. And after this, I think sometime tomorrow, we'll put up the link to this webinar on the CSE YouTube channel. So do please keep an eye out for that. If you want to share this with any colleagues or friends, please do. And on that note, I would like to thank you, Tanguy, very much for talking in this webinar and answering all the questions. And to thank the CSA team who have contributed significantly to making this 4-part measurements sort of webinar series work. And finally, of course, thank you for all the audience members who have sat through possibly this one and maybe even all 4 of the webinars. So thank you very much.